The night shift always had a certain hum to it, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel amplified, like the museum itself was breathing. On March 18, 1990, 2:00 a.m., in Boston. That hum settled over the marble floors of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum as a tired 23-year-old guard named Rick Abath pushed open the heavy security door to begin another graveyard shift he never wanted. His hair tied back, his eyes bleary from playing in his band the night before, Rick walked the same route he'd walked 100 times. In every retelling of this night, the world would come to imagine him as something he never saw himself being. The last line of defense for $500 million worth of irreplaceable art. Rembrandt, Vermeer, Degas, Manet, masterpieces, older than the country itself. But back then to Rick, it was just a job, a paycheck, a quiet room where nothing ever happened. He clocked in, nodded to the other guard, and settled into the cramped security desk. A bank of old cathode ray monitors flickered in front of him, showing grainy black and white feeds. There were no motion sensors in the galleries, no high-tech alarms, no armed guards. Just locked doors, aging cameras, and two men barely older than the paintings they were hired to watch over. Later, investigators would ask why the museum's security was so outdated, why the cameras didn't record, why the alarms didn't trigger, why two men with minimal training were responsible for protecting the greatest unsolved art trove in American history, but back then none of that mattered. The system had worked for decades until it didn't. At 1:24 a.m., a patrol car had been seen outside the museum. No one thought anything of it. The St. Patrick's Day crowd still wandered the streets, too drunk to care about art. But at 1:24 a.m., Rick Abath would later say, he felt something, a kind of pressure, like a cloud drifting into the room. It wasn't fear, not yet, just a prickling sense that the night was becoming strange. At 1:24 became 1:35, then 1:48. The monitors crackled softly. Rick leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. And then, at 1:51 a.m., the buzzer at the side entrance rang. Sharp, unexpected, jarring. Rick froze. No one in the history of the museum had ever walked into the Gardner at 2 a.m. Nobody rang that buzzer unless something was wrong. Through the grainy monitor, he saw two Boston police officers standing at the door. At least one of them said through the intercom, "We got a report of a disturbance." Rick blinked. A disturbance? Inside a museum closed for hours? The museum had rules, strict, inflexible, carved-in-stone rules, and the first was simple. Do not open the door at night. Ever. But here they were, two officers, in full uniform, badges glinting under the street lamp. They asked again. Rick hesitated, gripping the buzzer button. He could feel the decision sitting in his hand like a live wire, and then he pressed it. The lock clicked. What happened next would define his life. The two officers stepped inside. Their boots echoed in the empty foyer. They asked Rick to step away from the desk. They asked for identification. They asked if he was alone. And then one of them said something that made Rick's stomach drop. "You look familiar, are you wanted?" The words made no sense. But before he could react, the officer told him to come out from behind the desk. Rick hesitated again, sensing too late that something was wrong. The officer stepped closer. "Sir," he said, "this is procedure." Then the officer said it. The line that would appear in every documentary, every retelling, every theory. This is a robbery. And in one motion, fast and practiced. The officer's mustache peeled away from his lip, and the world realized what Rick never saw coming. They weren't cops at all. What unfolded after that was almost absurd. The man pretending to be a police officer handcuffed Rick, wrapped duct tape around his eyes, his mouth, his wrists, and asked almost politely if he was comfortable. Then he placed him in the basement next to the other guard, both of them bound like cocooned insects. Upstairs, in the darkness of the galleries, the thieves worked with precision. They knew which paintings to take. They knew the cameras didn't record. They avoided the most valuable piece in the museum, a priceless Titian, and instead cut a Rembrandt from its frame like a butcher slicing meat from bone. They smashed a panel from the Dutch room and removed a rare ancient finial. They plucked the Vermeer, one of only 34 in existence, and disappeared into the night with 13 pieces, carrying out the largest unsolved art heist in modern history. When Rick emerged hours later, his face red from the tape, his chest tight. The museum looked like a ghost town after a storm. Empty frames hung like outlines of missing persons. The police arrived for real this time, and as Rick stood under the harsh lights of questioning, the suspicion started almost immediately. Why did he open the door? Why did he break protocol? Why did he let them in? Why him? Over the years, Rick's name would become inseparable from the heist. Newspapers painted him as naive at best, complicit at worst. People said he looked too calm on the security tapes. They pointed out that he opened the door without hesitation. They noted his checkered past, a musician, a stoner, a guy who sometimes drank too much. They dissected his life, his habits, his expressions, the way he slouched in his chair on the night of the robbery. Former FBI agents went on record saying they believed he was involved. Armchair detectives insisted he was the inside man. What none of them knew was that Rick's life was unraveling behind the scenes. He lost his job, his reputation, his sense of safety. He grew older, with a quiet resentment settling in his bones. For decades he avoided cameras, avoided interviews, avoided anyone who wanted to look him in the eye and ask, "Did you do it?" But something strange began happening around the 25th anniversary of the theft. New evidence emerged, fragments at first, then larger patterns. Former guards revealed that other employees had opened the door late at night before, against policy, without consequence. A former museum security supervisor admitted that staff broke the rules regularly. Internal memos surfaced showing that Rick's breach of protocol was on TSP unusual, it was standard. Security experts re-examined the tapes and concluded that Rick's so-called suspicious behavior was, in fact, mundane. He didn't open the wrong door. He opened the only door the buzzer could ring from. And the biggest twist came when the FBI publicly stated that Rick was no longer a suspect, that they now believed the thieves were connected to Boston's criminal underworld, not the museum staff. For the first time in 30 years, Rick Abath was no longer the convenient scapegoat, but the real bombshell surfaced quietly. Buried in a footnote of an FBI briefing, investigators had found new fingerprints in the museum, prints that did not match Rick or any employee. Prints on the frame of the Rembrandt, prints on the security door, prints on objects the thieves touched. It was as if the ghosts of the real culprits had finally left their mark. Rick, who had spent decades being blamed for the greatest unsolved art heist in American history, had accidentally become the world's most valuable lead. His actions, the mistakes, the fatigue, the hesitation that opened the door, became the focal point of a new theory. Not that he helped the thieves, but that the thieves studied him. They watched his habits. They tracked the museum's weak points. They knew he was tired. They knew he was vulnerable. They knew he was human. And perhaps most tragically, they knew the world would blame him. Now in his 50s, living a quiet life far from Boston, Rick rarely speaks about that night. It's not because he's hiding something, but because it defined him in a way he never asked for. The night the world's greatest stolen masterpieces vanished into the darkness, Rick Abath became the accidental fulcrum of a mystery still unsolved. A man trapped between guilt and innocence, suspicion and truth. And somewhere out there in a private vault, a climate-controlled room, or the wall of a collector who will never reveal their secret, the missing. Vermeer, the Rembrandt, and the other 11 pieces sit untouched, locked away in the shadows. And through all the theories, the documentaries, the interrogations, the doubts, the decades of speculation, one question still remains, hovering like a ghost over the empty frames in the museum. If Rick Abath didn't he help pull off the greatest art heist in modern history? Then who did, and why did they choose that night, that guard, that moment? Because the truth, now clearer than ever, is that Rick Abath didn't mastermind the heist. He didn't profit from it. He didn't even see it coming. Well, he did. The only thing he did was open a door. And in doing so, he opened the greatest unsolved mystery in the art world.